Hi, everyone. So we ended last week talking about Islam and the destruction of the Mongols by the Abbasid Caliphate. By the Mongols of the Abbasid Caliphate, the great Islamic empire centered in Baghdad in the year 1258. This week, we're going to conclude our journey west across Asia with a look at the last of the three so-called gunpowder empires, which is how the authors of your textbook, Aloso and Willeford, do refer to them. The Ottomans. From a small tribe of Sunni Turks living in Asia Minor, Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, they spread, as you can see from the map on the first slide available on Blackboard. Within a century, they've largely supplanted their previous rulers of the Byzantine Empire and are laying siege to Constantinople. And in 1453, the Ottoman forces under the command of Sultan Mehmed II, also known as Mehmed the Conqueror, besieged Constantinople for several weeks before ultimately breaching its defenses. The city, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, was heavily fortified with massive defensive walls that had protected the city for millennia. However, with advancements in siege technology and a determined Ottoman army, Mehmed II employed various tactics to weaken the city's defenses. For example, he ordered the construction of a road to transport ships across land, bypassing the chain barrier that had protected the city's harbor, the Golden Horn. The Ottomans also utilized massive cannons, including the famous basilica, to bombard the walls of Constantinople. According to various historical sources, the basilica cannon was reported to be exceptionally large. It was said to have been constructed by a Hungarian engineer named Orban and was transported to Constantinople specifically for the siege. Descriptions suggest that the cannon was likely made of bronze and was extremely heavy, and reported to have a length ranging from anywhere to 26 to 30 feet and a bore diameter of roughly 30 to 36 inches. Estimates regarding the weight of the cannonball it fired range from about 1,100 to 1,500 pounds. But anyway, after a prolonged siege, on May 29, 1453, the Ottoman forces breached the walls in several locations, overwhelming the defenders. The final assault led to intense fighting within the city, resulting in its fall. The last Byzantine Emperor, Constantine XI Palaeologus, died in the battle defending the city. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and the true beginning of Ottoman rule in the region. The event had significant consequences for the history of Europe and the Mediterranean, influencing trade routes, cultural exchanges, and the balance of power in the region for centuries to come. In fact, it was one of the few dates you'll see in this class that I recommend you lock into your memory. It is the second of your two possible extra credit questions on the exam in just 2 weeks, if you want to take a moment to jot it down. The year 1453. Let's start first with its impact on existing trade between Europe and Asia. And I mean specifically here the Silk Road we talked about in one of our previous lectures about China. The coming of the Ottomans seriously raises the already high cost of doing business via the Silk Road. To this day, transporting something over land is about 10 times more expensive than transporting something by sea. If you're interested in the reasons why this is, you can come ask me during the Q&A today. But apart from the increased economic costs, there are also geopolitical concerns. Bear in mind, the Crusades, the attempt by Christian European soldiery to retake the Holy Land surrounding Jerusalem, had at that time only ended a century prior, the Ninth Crusade having been launched in 1272. And so it's far from clear to people like Prince Henry of Portugal, also known as the Navigator, who sets up a school dedicated to deep water sailing, that the Ottomans can be relied upon to keep trade with China and India open. As an aside, crusading, or the waging of holy war, will be part of European geopolitics for over a century at this time. In fact, it really isn't until the late 15th century that you stop seeing these waged, though no longer are they being waged in the name of capturing parts of the Holy Land, even though this is generally how the Crusades are popularly remembered, when they're remembered at all, that is. Many of the Crusades were waged within Europe, against the pagans in Scandinavia or in Spain to drive out the Muslims, a centuries-long campaign known as the Reconquista, which we'll talk about more later today. It's in this context, that of religious conflict, that we'll move on to the Ottoman push into the Balkans. First, etymologically, Balkan, quote unquote, is the Turkish word for mountain or chain of wooded mountains. And the word is believed to have originated from the Old Turkish Baal, meaning high, and Khan, meaning blood. And this is possibly due to the redness of the setting sun reflecting on the mountains, giving them a reddish hue, or perhaps referring to the wars fought in these mountainous regions, which were terribly bloody. The Ottoman Empire began its expansion into the Balkans in the late 14th century. Their conquest in the region began with the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, although the process of establishing full control took several centuries. Prior to the Ottoman conquest, the Balkan Peninsula was inhabited by various medieval kingdoms, principalities, and states, including the Byzantine Empire and the kingdoms of Serbia, Bulgaria, Croatia, and other smaller feudal entities. These small, mostly Orthodox Christian states were often in conflict with each other, creating a fragmented and politically unstable region. As the Ottomans expanded into the Balkans, they gradually conquered and incorporated these existing political entities into their empire. And as you can see, they came quite close to capturing Vienna, home of the Habsburg dynasty. That the Ottomans were able to put such pressure on the Habsburg holdings goes a long way toward explaining why the French, beginning in the 16th century, engaged in an alliance with the Ottomans, something that absolutely scandalized Christian opinion. To have one of the two foremost Catholic powers allying with the foremost Muslim power against their brother Catholics. But as we'll talk about here in a little while, successive French kings were fighting encirclement by European history's most storied house, which had also come to control the Spanish throne. But for now, back to the Ottomans in the Balkans. Now, over the centuries, the Ottoman Empire replaced the existing political structures with its own administrative system. They established a system of local governance through the use of governors known as pashas or beys, who were responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and administering the conquered territories on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople, later to be renamed Istanbul, much later. This included perhaps the most popularly known aspect of the Ottoman Empire, the famed Janissaries. If you've already done the reading for this week, that is chapter 2 of Aloso and Williford, you know about the Janissaries. But for those of you who haven't or have never heard of the Janissaries before, I'll tell you. In regions that were too poor to pay in money or produce, the Ottomans often took a tax in the form of people. For example, young boys were taken as tribute captives from villages in the Balkans. They were converted to Islam, educated, and trained into an elite fighting force called the Janissaries, who reported directly to the emperor. Because they were personally loyal to one man, the Janissaries became politically powerful. Fear that the private army would betray him and name another heir sultan in the manner of the old Roman Praetorian Guard often caused new rulers to regularly assassinate all their brothers as soon as they took the throne. The Janissaries were the Ottomans' most effective weapon for centuries, from about 1363 to the early 19th century, when the Sultan decided to disband them in favor of a modern military. The Janissaries mutinied and marched on the Sultan's palace, but several thousand were wiped out by modern artillery, and their survivors were then executed. Just to put a neat little bow on this particular aspect of the Ottoman Empire and its relationship with Europe before moving on to discuss the development of Europe up to the point in our narrative where we now find ourselves, that is, right around the year 1500, Ottoman rule in the Balkans lasted for several centuries, significantly shaping the cultural, religious, and political landscape of the region. However, various Balkan states eventually gained independence from the Ottoman Empire through a series of nationalist movements and wars during the 19th and early 20th centuries, leading to the gradual decline and dissolution of Ottoman influence in the region. This plays a huge part in the run-up to World War I, the most transformative and important event of the 20th century, I and other historians would argue. But these nationalist movements have help, specifically from their fellow Orthodox Slav power, the Russian Empire. Now, I do need to get to Russia because I haven't introduced it yet, and it really doesn't fit well with the narrative about Europe I'm going to spend the latter half of today's lecture building up. So after a few more words on the Ottomans, we're just going to dive right into the emergence of the Russian Empire during this period from under the quote-unquote Mongol yoke. See, I told you I would mention them again. Okay, a final note on the Ottomans here relates to the interfaith aspect of its empire. Unlike the Europeans, who, as we'll see later today, just couldn't stop killing each other over religion, the Ottoman rulers and administrators were comparatively tolerant. There was a tax called the jizya imposed on non-Muslim subjects, who were known as dhimmis, and this was a poll tax specifically leveled on non-Muslims, such as Christians and Jews, who were considered quote-unquote people of the book in Islamic tradition. Just a quick side note here, this is because in Islamic tradition, the Prophet Muhammad is believed to be a descendant of Ibrahim in Arabic, through his son Ishmael, who we know Abraham had with Hagar prior to conceiving Isaac with his wife Sarah. Anyway, the jizya was a form of tribute or protection tax in exchange for the exemption from military service and the guarantee of protection for their lives, property, and religious practices under Islamic rule. I've read of many conversions being undertaken to avoid this tax, as the tax was not imposed on Muslims. However, they were obligated to pay a different tax, the zakat, which was a sort of a form of obligatory charity or almsgiving in Islam. It's quite possible that it was just a question of local conditions, as the Ottoman Empire was very decentralized and taxes were often administered almost entirely locally, meaning the amount of the tax could vary based on factors such as income, wealth, or just the discretion of the local authorities. Okay, so Russia. See how smooth that transition was? Okay. So if you look at the map of 14th century Europe that you'll see on the slides, again, available on Blackboard, you'll note that at the far eastern end of the map, you see the quote-unquote Golden Horde. This was one of the four Mongol empires that survived the breakup of the Great Mongol Empire that briefly spanned the entire breadth of Asia in the 13th century, which we've mentioned repeatedly now. The Russian Empire grew out of resistance to Mongol rule. A ruler of the Grand Duchy of Moscow named Ivan III, later called Ivan the Great, refused to pay tribute to the Golden Horde, and after the death of the last Greek Orthodox Christian emperor, whose death we just mentioned above, Ivan decided his kingdom would become the new Rome, that is, the third Rome after the fall of Constantinople, the second Rome, and then the original Rome in the 5th century, a millennia prior. Ivan ruled for over 40 years, from 1462 to 1505, and he tripled the size of his territory. His grandson, Ivan IV, popularly known as Ivan the Terrible in the West, although this probably isn't the correct translation from what I've read. Probably a better translation to the word Grozny would be like formidable or awe-inspiring. After it all, it isn't as though in the totally blood-soaked history of conquest, Ivan IV was particularly brutal or anything. Like his grandfather, he also would rule for 40 years, from 1547 to 1584. And he was the first to declare himself Tsar of all the Russias, a title which is Russian for quote-unquote Caesar. The German Kaiser is another word that derives from Caesar. And you should write that particular note down because it's one of your quiz questions for this week. Anyway, Ivan IV annexed the Khanates of Kazan, Astrakhan, and Siberia, and recruited Cossacks from southern Russia and Ukraine to colonize Siberia. It's worth noting that while these, quote-unquote conquests did expand the empire, these were mostly unoccupied or very sparsely occupied lands who couldn't offer really any serious resistance to the Russians as they pushed eastward and southward. But that's your shoehorned crash course on how, from its origins as a small principality centered around the city of Moscow in the 12th century, Russia became the largest kingdom in the world, stretching from the Black Sea to the Pacific Ocean. I'll have much more to say on Russia later because it plays a central role in some of the key events of later lectures in the development of Europe. For now, however, it wouldn't make much sense to go any further with this part of the narrative arc without introducing Europe. So, with what remains of our time today, that's what I'm going to do. Directing your attention back to the map you see, which depicts the continent of Europe in the later 14th century, you'll notice that it is in some ways familiar. You have France, England, Denmark, Sweden, a few others, but otherwise the political map looks quite foreign to what we see today. Let's start with the far west, the Iberian Peninsula, where we have the kingdoms of Portugal, Castile, Aragon, and a few slivers of territory, Aquitaine, Navarre, Granada. I'll start with Granada. This was the last Muslim presence in Europe outside of the Balkans at this point. If you recall from our last lecture late last week, at one point the Muslim armies of the Umayyad Caliphate had pushed all the way across the Pyrenees and were only just turned back by Charlemagne's grandfather at the Battle of Tours. For centuries then, it was a slow process of gradually pushing the Muslim forces out of the Iberian Peninsula, which those forces continued to occupy in the aftermath. This was the Reconquista I mentioned earlier, or the Reconquest. The Emirate of Granada was the last remaining Muslim polity here. And in 1492, that's right, 1492, this process was completed by Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. They had united the crowns of Castile and Aragon, and they would later seize Navarre, essentially completing the making of modern Spain. Next up, we see France, heart of the old Frankish kingdom. Brittany, Aquitaine, Savoy, Provence. These were all independent polities that would later be swallowed up in the coming 2 centuries as successive French kings sought to expand their power and influence. The real trouble here is Central Europe, starting with where modern Germany and Italy are located, because as you can see on the other side of them, you've got Austria, Hungary, Poland, Serbia, whose names are familiar, even if territorially things are quite unlike the present day. Jumping back to Central Europe, I'm going to attempt to briefly explain what is going on here. You have the Holy Roman Empire, which in the words of the French satirist Voltaire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, and you have the states of the Italian peninsula. Now, I actually want to spend much of the remaining time today talking about the states of Italy, because these were actually the most technologically, economically, and politically sophisticated entities of Europe at this time. So just very briefly with regards to the Holy Roman Empire, because I'll be speaking much more about it when we meet again on Thursday. This is basically the area that will eventually become Germany. It is the most politically divided part of Europe, with literally hundreds of political entities and authorities, from tiny kingdoms, bishoprics, and free cities to larger entities like Bohemia and West Prussia. It is an absolutely fascinating entity, the Holy Roman Empire, and as I said, we'll talk more about it Thursday in the context of the Protestant Reformation and the 30 Years' War. Okay. Before I move on to the Italian states, on this slide here, I just want to briefly walk you through a few maps that show you how you get to that point. Just take a look at those. I'm not able to put them up here on the channel yet. I need to work on how to do that. But first, on the left here, you see the Roman Empire split into East and West, which, as you already know, the Eastern Empire was based in Constantinople, and it will survive the period of barbarian invasions, quote unquote, and carry on up to the start of our period before basically being conquered by the Ottoman Turks. But the Western Empire, based in Rome and eventually in Ravenna, will succumb to multiple barbarian invasions, and these tribes, the Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Vandals, Burgundy, etc., wind up taking their respective chunks of the empire, and these are often referred to as the barbarian successor states, although much contemporary scholarship eschews this habit. Moving on, unquestionably the most successful of the successor states in the West is the Frankish kingdom, also known as the Carolingian Empire. On the left, you see the Franks at their most expansive under the Christian king Charlemagne in the late 8th and early 9th centuries before the empire fragmented under his successors. Christianity, of course, is the religion of Europe, virtually everywhere by 1500, some small Muslim communities in the Balkans accepted. How this came to be may not be entirely obvious to you, and so I have also up there a map showing the spread of Christianity in Europe. And before talking about the Italian peninsula during the late medieval and early modern period, the great cultural product of the Renaissance, its highly developed financial and commercial centers, its technological achievements, etc., I'm going to give you a crash course on Christianity in Europe, essentially from the Roman Empire in 1500, and Charlemagne and the Franks were to play a significant part in this spread and development. So here we go. Christianity, which spreads from the area of Roman Palestine, is made the official religion of the Roman Empire by Theodosius after missionaries such as St. Paul bring it to the capital. Initially persecuted, its eventual acceptance under Constantine leads to a rapid adoption. And as the political authority of Rome begins to disintegrate in the 4th and 5th centuries, it's the church that really acts as the vessel carrying a synthesized Latin culture safely through the fraught period of late antiquity and into the early Middle Ages, partnering with the new barbarian kings, many of whom either already were Christianized or were willing to become Christian in exchange for the support of the church, such as Clovis, an earlier Frankish king of the late 5th, early 6th century. As you can see from the second of the two slides there, Christianity has indeed already become predominant by the time of Clovis. As we move on to the next slide, you can see that the continued spread of Christianity is going to take some time. We've spoken about institutions to some degree. Institutionalization and the ability to project sustained concentrated force is a key to understanding historical transformations, and the church and the military orders are central to the creation of a unified Europe, which was called Christendom. Make no mistake, the forging of a unified Christendom was a bloody affair, and attempts to keep it together would prove bloodier still. We won't make it to the Reformation or the 30 Years' War today. That will have to wait until Thursday, but some of the expansions on this slide provide an example of what I mean. In yellow, you have the Saxon Wars of Charlemagne, which the royal Frankish annals record, and they have Charlemagne executing pagans by the thousands. Of course, when the Mongols sacked a city, they would sometimes execute the whole population. The real point here being that history is too often a brutal and totally pitiless affair. But then in green, you have the spreading of Christianity by the Teutonic orders into modern-day Poland, Estonia, etc. The Latvians, as you can see, were not yet Christianized. They were notoriously resistant, refusing to give up their paganism. Now, this emphasis on conquest in the military orders isn't to suggest that there weren't missionary converts. Of course, there were. The example of Ireland being one of the most famous. But it is to emphasize that there was a very clear relationship and often partnership between secular and religious authorities, though these could and did come into conflicts. The establishment and evolution of these separate spheres of power and influence between ecclesiastical and secular authorities is something that we'll continue to track as we move forward. Unfortunately, given the nature of survey courses, we're necessarily just skimming along the surface. But if you're interested, come see me or email me for further reading recommendations. For example, we basically had to breeze right over the periods of like Pope, anti-Pope, the Great Schism. Again, for those interested, come and see me. So final thing for today, the late medieval and early modern Italian peninsula. It is not quote unquote Italy, not unified under any central political authority. Hence, we see again the later quote from Metternich disparaging the notion of a quote-unquote Italy. But to actually this variety, this division, difference, heterogeneity, however you want to describe it, that really makes this the most advanced and wealthy region anywhere in Europe at this time. During the late medieval and early modern periods, the Italian peninsula was a diverse region consisting of numerous city-states and regional powers. These states had varying forms of government, economic activities, financial systems, and contributions to technological innovation, all of which contributed to the cultural and economic vibrancy of the Italian peninsula during the time. In terms of the types of government, you have cities like Venice, Genoa, and Florence that were republics governed by councils or oligarchic ruling bodies. Other regions were ruled by princes or noble families, such as Milan under the Visconti and Sforza dynasties, or the papal states governed by the Pope. In large part because of its geography, being right there in the center of the very easily navigable Mediterranean Sea, the Italian city-states were renowned for their thriving trade networks, commerce, and banking activities. Cities like Venice and Genoa had powerful maritime empires and controlled significant trade routes in the Mediterranean. If you're interested in learning more, one of the supplemental videos this week is about the Republic of Venice, probably the most powerful and prosperous of the Italian policies. Florence became a prominent banking center with the influential banking families like the Medici contributing to its economic prosperity, and they pioneered many modern banking practices. There was the development of double entry bookkeeping and the establishment of letters of credit, which facilitated international trade. Unsurprisingly, given their centrality to the commerce of the Mediterranean and its exposure to ideas and products coming to Europe from along the Silk Road, places like Venice and Florence became centers of innovation in various fields, such as navigation, shipbuilding, and cartography, but also in manufacturing, ideas which were then copied and disseminated in some early examples of industrial espionage. Some of those who gained terrific wealth from these enterprises, banking families like the Medici, most famously, played a vital role in funding businesses, art, and culture, contributing to the flourishing of the Renaissance. A few quick things about the Renaissance, because your reading for this week goes into the period in some depth. The term Renaissance originating in France during the 19th century to describe this period of cultural, artistic, and intellectual rebirth. The period Renaissance meaning a sort of a rediscovery, rebirth, revival. The Renaissance was characterized by a renewed interest in classical art, literature, philosophy, and culture from ancient Greece and Rome. It marked a significant shift from the medieval period with its almost complete focus on spiritualism and obedience to the church, and emphasized humanism, individualism, and the pursuit of knowledge. This cultural movement had a profound impact on various aspects of European society, including art, architecture, literature, science, politics, and religion, and profoundly shaped the course of Western civilization. We'll close today with a few comments on Italy's most famous political philosopher of the period, Niccolò Machiavelli. Famous for his work, The Prince, and often associated with the kind of ends justify the means thinking, Machiavelli's real concern was the promotion of a leader strong enough to unify Italy. You see, already during this period, there was a great deal of wasted energy being spent by the various Italian polities fighting one another. There were also outside powers attracted by Italy's wealth who desired to interfere, and he recognized the lack of unity made the Italian state easy prey to outsiders. This was not to happen, however, for another 300 years. This was much the same story as the German polities, who we'll talk about Thursday when we pick up our narrative with the Great Protestant Reformation. Thanks very much.